Hi everyone, we're going to get started with our next talk. Elizabeth Krumbach works at HP, where she works on the OpenStack open source project as part of the core infrastructure team. There they run the Linux-based servers and services such as a wiki, etherpad, and other services, as well as the fully open source continuous integration and code review system for developers. And today she'll be talking about a career in free and open source software. So without further ado, here's Elizabeth.
So I'm going to ask a few questions first. First, who all here knows what free and open source software is? All right, how many of you use it? Contribute to it? Okay, perfect. So a little bit about myself. Nathan mentioned that I work at HP. I was hired there in January, and I work directly on the open source project. So that means I don't really work on anything internal to HP until they call me in to consult with teams who are looking to open source their software. So I act sort of as a consultant for those internal teams who want to learn how to do this open source thing. On OpenStack, we work on the project infrastructure, which is, again, the tools that the developers use to do their work. So the code review system, the revision control system, and then all the supporting tools around that. Like we manage the chat bots, and we manage the etherpads and all the collaborative tools and everything. So we're pretty much a team of systems administrators. About half of us work at HP, and then the other half work directly for the OpenStack Foundation. HP also employs a number of developers who are working directly on OpenStack itself. There are a few reasons for this at HP because HP runs a public cloud based on OpenStack, and then they also have services and deployments that they do for other companies. So that's what I do during the day. In my free time, I do a lot of work on the Ubuntu Linux project. I'm a member of the Community Council, which is one of the two governing bodies of the project. We have the Tech Board, which handles the technical direction of the project, and then the Community Council handles things like making sure teams have the proper resources they need, like the documentation team has access to the tools that they need and translations and other things. So we sort of make sure things keep going smoothly, that everyone's being nice to each other, and if they're not, we tell them to be nice to each other. And then last year, I won an open source award given out by O'Reilly, which is pretty exciting because they give out 5 per year, and I received that for my work in the Ubuntu project. I've been doing open source work. I started using Linux 2001, started my first contributions, which was planning events for Linux meetups in 2002 or so. So I've been doing this stuff for a long time, contributed to my first project in 2005, and then got a job working with open source in 2006. So pretty much everyone already raised their hand saying that they know what open source software is, but I pulled this from Wikipedia, just in case you want to read a slide with tons of text on it. But it's pretty much, it's software for which the source code is made freely available and has a license, which means you can share the software and build upon it and redistribute it yourself. Depending on the license, you may need to redistribute all your source code that you added to it as well, but different licenses in open source require different things. This is in contrast to proprietary software, where you only get the executable binary to run on your system. You don't get any of the source code. So you're really limited by APIs and plugins and other things that you can build upon the software, but you can't actually change the software yourself. And you can't give it away to your friends, because mostly. So if you're giving away the software for free, right, like how do you make money doing this? How do you make a lot of money doing this? Because a lot of us do. So companies, they have a few models for making money in open source. One of the big ones is products and services. So that's sort of part of what HP does. So we have a service that's HP Cloud, which is a public cloud, which is similar to Amazon. I should explain. OpenStack is sort of an open source version of Amazon EC2. So you can like load up instances of Linux and Windows and on demand and tear them down on demand and all that. So OpenStack is an open source implementation of that. So other companies can run their own clouds running the OpenStack software. So anyway, HP has OpenStack, HP Cloud, and that's sort of a service we run. And then we also have products that are built around that as well. There's also open source core companies. This would be places like Puppet Labs, Sugar CRM, and there are lots of others where there's an open source community version of the software. And then beyond that, there's professional or enterprise versions, which you pay extra for. You get extra features. You usually get a support contract and other things. So that's an open source core sort of company. There's also deployment and management, which is a big thing a lot of the larger companies do. Instead of just downloading and running OpenStack yourself, for instance, you'll pay a company like HP to come in and install it in your organization. This is becoming a lot more common as companies sort of understand their core competencies and decide that they don't want to hire a whole IT team for this. It's cheaper just to pay another company to come in and build the cloud for them. Even though it's open source, and even though they could do it themselves if they hire the engineers, they don't want to hire the engineers. So deployment and management is pretty big. And then there's support contracts that some companies do to support open source software. Initially, when people were talking about how to make money in open source, this was sort of the big one. Like they're like, oh, everyone's going to make tons of money on support. It turns out there's not actually a lot of money in support. So the companies who tried to do that didn't end up being big money makers. It's really the first two that make a lot, but there is some money in support. So why would you want to work on open source? I'm going to go in each one of these bullet points in more depth. There are a few reasons. You find a tool that you want to use and you want to fix something or change something. You sort of feel like you want to share your passion for technology with other people. You get to work with lots of other people, which leads to lots of professional and personal growth, not just the same people in the same office every single day. And then it's also, you can be part of the biggest projects in the world because open source is used all over the place. So the first one is, you find a piece of software that you really like and you want to change it. That's what we call in open source world scratching your own itch. It's like you have a problem, you want to fix it. And that's the way a lot of people get involved with open source. So that's pretty much their first contribution. They say, I want to fix something. And then they get sucked into the whole thing. So they contribute code and they expand upon it and they do bug fixes and other things. And that ends up being a big entry point for a lot of people. This is pretty much why I got involved. I really like working on software, like just for fun. And it's no fun if you just build something for yourself in your basement and you don't share it with anyone. So I shared it with everyone. So I started putting like scripts up on my website that I wanted to share, Perl scripts and things that I had written for silly things like IRC bots and other things. And I didn't really understand open source, but I was just like, I want everyone to use this. That would be so cool if someone told me they were using my thing. And then eventually I sort of learned about open source and sort of got involved in bigger projects. A lot of open source people fundamentally also sort of believe in freedom and openness and equal access to technology. So I mentioned a lot of companies do deployments and are paid to do these things. But at the same time, while a big company can pay for someone to come in and deploy OpenStack for them, a little school in Africa can also deploy OpenStack. They have a bunch of volunteers and they can do it themselves. For them, it's really they have more time than money, whereas a lot of these other companies have more money than time and talent. So providing equal access to technology is something that I believe strongly in, and a lot of the people who work on open source do as well. This is a really exciting one. You get to work with people from lots of different cultures, so you don't feel sort of insulated in just working with other Americans and solving the problems of other Americans. One of the interesting things I've learned working on the Ubuntu project, which is a derivative of Ubuntu Linux flavor, is there's a lot of people in the world who don't have access to good internet, obviously, right? But you don't really think about that day to day when you have high-speed internet. So one of the things we've been trying to do in the operating system, Ubuntu, is provide more tools so people can go to a coffee shop, download some stuff, and then install it back when they get home or deploy things to different systems. And it's something I wouldn't have thought of if I was just working with people just like me, because people just like me have really fast internet. So working with different cultures and understanding the needs of other people has been a very interesting collaboration for me. Also, lots of different companies. So I don't work in an office. I work from home, and on a day-to-day basis, I will work with colleagues from HP, people from the OpenStack Foundation, people from Red Hat, IBM, Dell, like all these different companies. And it makes your network of people in technology that you know much wider than just your colleagues at the one company. And it also is a very interesting opportunity to sort of understand what the needs of other companies are, and then sort of bring that into your own company, and it's all a big collaboration. Like, we're all going in the same direction, working on this big, massive project together. Also, since we're all working at different companies and we're from all over the world, a number of the larger open source projects have collaboration summits where we get together once or twice a year in one place around the world, and we just work on things together. So through my work between Ubuntu and OpenStack, I've been all over Europe, going to Hong Kong next month for an OpenStack summit. So you end up meeting a lot of people and going to interesting places when you work on this stuff. Another big reason people get into it is because they want their name on something that's like a huge part of the world, right? So Apache, it used to host over 50%, but it's sort of gone down, of the web servers in the world. And that's a huge project. The reason they've lost ground actually is because other open source web servers have gone into the market. So I mean, over half the world's using open source web servers at this point. And then I'm sure you've all heard of Firefox, the web browser, Linux. Linux pretty much powers the internet at this point. If you look at Facebook, Google, Amazon, they're all using Linux underneath. Like, that's what powers the websites. And that's really the only reason a lot of these companies exist. If they had to pay licensing rights on every single operating system they spun up, like, they would have never gotten off the ground. But Linux is free. It can be torn down to a very slim thing that you can run, like Google does. They have like their own distribution that's a super slimmed down thing just to do their specific thing. And they can do that because it's open source and it's free and they can do whatever they want. And you can contribute to open source too. And Linux, the Linux kernel, you obviously have to understand how to contribute to a kernel and like understand kernel stuff. But it's pretty open for contributions. I mean, anyone can get a patch in if they write a good patch for the kernel. And then I sort of touched upon this with the whole international travel thing and learning about other cultures and things. So you get to work with other cultures and have exciting experiences, meet lots of interesting people. It also gives you real-world experience with real software projects being used in production without having professional experience. So I didn't have any professional experience when I started working in open source. I just really liked computers, and I said, hey, how am I going to get started with all this? So I started working on stuff, started collaborating with projects, and I didn't really have professional experience. So when I went to go find a job, I was actually able to put a lot of my open source work on my resume. And my open source work ended up being what really made me a standout candidate for a lot of positions, because there's lots of sysadmins in the world, right? But there's only a few who are really familiar with open source and are very collaborative and have that sort of way that you can work with a lot of people. And it also sort of shows that you have a passion for technology. If you're also doing open source work, that means it's not just a paycheck for you oftentimes. So you build up this portfolio while you're working on free software, even if you're just doing it for fun. And anyone can do it for fun. You don't need any sort of experience. You build that up as you go on. If anyone has questions throughout, just raise your hand, let me know. And one of the things a lot of people worry about, they say, like, I don't want to contribute to open source because I'm a really bad coder, and then I don't want a future employer seeing that code. I can say that like, never happens. I mean, they may look at your GitHub repository or do something to look at what your code is, but as long as you make improvements over time, it's not like they're going to pull up something from 2008 and be like, wow, we're not going to hire you in 2013. That just doesn't happen. They look at recent stuff. And the fact is, like, a lot of people looking at this stuff aren't actually looking at your code. They're looking at the fact that you contribute, and they're looking at what you're contributing to. So, I mean, coding skills can be improved, but the passion that it takes to contribute to open source software and be involved in that way, in a public way with other people, is a very valuable skill. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. Put your crappy code on GitHub, it's fine. Just put your good code up afterwards. So there's lots of stuff you can work on. Obviously, the first one on this list is programming, because everyone thinks you need to be an awesome programmer to work on open source. I'm not a programmer. I'm a sysadmin, which means I'm a really bad programmer. I can fix things, but when Python people look at my code, they run away screaming. So programming is a big one, obviously, because you need to write the software that the whole project is based around. So programmers, yes, definitely. My friend Paul just did a talk about Debian, where he talked a lot about software packaging. Software packaging is pretty much you take the source code and you put it into what we call a package, which defines things like what dependencies it has in an operating system, where it's going to dump all of its files on the file system and other things, and makes it so it's easily installable through a package manager in your Linux distribution. So software packaging is one of the first places I got involved. You don't really need to be a programmer. You need to know how to read source code, and you need to know how to understand key bugs in programming and other things, so you can write patches against the program if you need to. But it's one step sort of below programming when it comes to like programming skills. Like you don't need to be a super programmer to do packaging. So that was fun, and that's very important. There's like 45,000 packages in Debian right now, and those are all maintained just by people and companies. Actually, the first job I had, where I was able to work on open source in my job, software packaging was a big part of my job. I was a systems administrator on Linux, Debian, and in the course of working at the job there, we were deploying servers all over. I was living in Philadelphia, all over Philadelphia, and sometimes we'd need a piece of software that wasn't in Debian. So I'd create a Debian package for that software, and then I'd say, "Hey, boss, I'm going to upload this to Debian, so it's easy to install next time. We don't have to make the package ourselves, and other people can collaborate with us on it and everything." So I was able to contribute to Debian just because I was doing it in the course of my day anyway. So uploading it wasn't a big stretch for me. You can also work with bugs. This is also something that you have to be somewhat technical, but not hugely technical. It pretty much is when someone submits a bug to a bug tracker, you have to make sure you're able to replicate it. So bug triagers pretty much go in, look at the bug report, see if they can replicate it, if they have the right hardware and software and whatnot. And then assuming they can replicate it, they'll pass it on to the developer. If they can't, then they'll go back to the person who reported it and say, "Hey, I need more information on this bug." And bug triagers like this, people working with bugs, are super important. Just because we need people doing that. Because if a developer is not going to waste her time on something if it doesn't have complete information. So if normal people can just go in and say, "Hey, we need more information because I can't replicate this yet," it takes a lot of the burden off the developers, and it makes things much better for people who report bugs because someone actually responds to them. You also got things like documentation. Documentation in open source projects has gotten much better over the past few years, but it used to be horrible because it was sort of, there weren't really documentation writers in open source. It was all developers trying to write documentation. And it turns out documentation is actually a skill, so when you have random developers writing it, it tends to be not very good and written in strange ways. It's not really written towards the user, it's written towards the developer, and they're just putting down what they remember, so things get left out. But documentation was one of the first things I got involved with. I was sitting in a chat channel with a piece of software I was using, and the lead developer was like, "Oh, our documentation's way out of date, and I hate writing it." I'm like, "I can write it. Like, how hard is that going to be?" Turns out it's actually kind of hard, even though I like writing. You have to learn the documentation formats that the open source project used, so we were using DocBook, which is all kinds of fun. But I figured it out, and I got it. And then I got my name in a changelog, and that was super exciting. Yeah. Also, things like support. You don't need to be a super rock star at the software to be able to help people. You need to be using the software probably a little bit longer than someone else. So if you've been using it for a week and someone's been using it for a day, you can probably help them out. And a lot of support questions actually end up being pretty simple. So you need to have basic understanding of the software to help people out, but not a ton. Testing and quality assurance. That's something that's gotten a lot of attention in open source lately. So I mentioned that the thing I do at work is manage the infrastructure for the OpenStack project. The OpenStack project has tons of testing. First, we do code review. Once the code has been reviewed by a couple of people, it then goes through a series of tests. So we do functional and unit tests, and then we do integration tests, because OpenStack is made up of lots of different pieces that all need to work together. So when we're merging code in, we want to make sure that a change in this project isn't going to break something over in this project. So our whole test suite, depending on the software, takes about a half hour. But there has to be people working on this. There's people writing software tests, and there's people keeping the infrastructure running. There's people making sure that the code has good test coverage. And this is something that's somewhat new in open source. A lot of companies used to do tests sort of behind closed doors because they're the ones using software. But this is all sort of getting out to the open now, and there's a lot of open source tools popping up to do testing. There's also things like design. and user interface work. Again, this is something that open source lacked in the past, but a lot of projects have come to understand that having a pretty website and a nice background actually makes a huge difference to how many users you have and the impression that users have of your software. So design is something that a lot of people can get into, unless you're like me and you can't even draw stick figures. Do design. And then there's this whole broad thing I'm going to call community, which is doing things in the community to sort of make sure it runs. Make sure that the team has meetings, make sure that meetups are organized in person if you want to do those, make sure the mailing list is moderated, the IRC channel is kept under control, all kinds of little administrative stuff that you need to keep going in the community. Making sure people aren't getting into fights. If there's a flame war on the list, stepping in and being like, you guys have to stop this. And just doing other sort of greasing the wheel sort of thing, making sure people have the resources they need to do their work and other things. And then I ran out of space. But as a systems administrator, one of the things that I was doing in the Ubuntu project for a long time, still am, I run a bunch of servers that I pay for, VPSs, just virtual servers, for community members to come and install stuff on. Or they say, I want to try out this new web app or something for a project I'm working on in Ubuntu. So I'll just toss up the software somewhere so they can give it a test run. And I also give out shell accounts. We use chat a lot in open source. So some people want to be connected 24/7 so they never miss anything. And a lot of people don't have the resources to have their home computer online all the time. So I'll give them a shell account so then they can either run their IRC chat client on the server or use some sort of bouncer so they can just reconnect it when they get back online. So there's all kinds of things. If you look around and get involved in an open source project, whatever your talents are, there's probably a way that you can help people out. I mean, I didn't go into Ubuntu planning on running servers. I just saw that lots of people were having trouble not finding resources they needed and said, I've got a few bucks and some time, so I'll just toss up a few servers for people to use. Yeah.
And that just, if they want to not miss anything, then why not just have an archive of the chat log?
Yeah, so the question is, if they don't want to miss anything, why not have an archive of the chat log? A lot of projects do that now, but it's still sort of controversial in some projects. Some people don't want the public logs out there, and that's just because they goof off in IRC and they have silly conversations. They don't want things they said stupidly in anger up on the internet. I don't agree with this. I think they should all be public because it's an open source project and you're supposed to be serious, at least somewhat on topic and not saying crazy things. But yeah, so there is a problem with people not wanting to do that. And also, there's a big mix of projects that have logging and others that don't, and it ends up just being easier if you can just have it all in your client. So, and going back and reading logs. It's actually harder than reading a back scroll in your client. Just, I don't know, because of the way our brains work. Any other questions? Yeah.
What volunteer projects have you What volunteer hello. What volunteer projects have you worked on, if I may ask?
Sure. So directly open source projects, I've worked on Biddleby, which is an instant messenger gateway for IRC. So all my Facebook messages and AOL, IM messages and whatever kids are using these days, that all comes into my IRC client. So all my chat is in one place because I can't stand the web browser. So it all just comes into my chat client. So that's the first one I worked on. That's where I wrote documentation, wrote a few patches. I spent time doing packaging in Debian. And then when Ubuntu started coming out, I sort of migrated into that community because there were a lot more opportunities for all of this kinds of stuff. Debian certainly has them, but their teams are not as easy to get involved with, or they're just not as valued in the project. They're changing that. But at the time, Ubuntu was a really friendly, fun place to get involved with. So that's where I spent pretty much most of my time now, my free time. And then, of course, OpenStack now with my job at HP. Aside from that, I'm also on the board of a nonprofit that puts Linux computers into schools. And last year, I volunteered with another nonprofit that we went to Ghana in Western Africa to deploy a bunch of Ubuntu systems to a bunch of schools there. So that's, yeah.
Are you looking for donations?
Am I looking for donations? So the nonprofit that I'm part of, the one that puts Ubuntu systems in schools, it's called Partimus.org. That's we share in Latin, one word. That's always looking for donations of both money and hardware that's not too old.
How do you spell it?
Partinus.
.org?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And then all the projects. Debian definitely takes donations. Ubuntu is actually backed by a company, so you can give them money, but you're not giving it to a donationable place. You're giving it to a company, so I don't do that. So things you can work on. And then for those of you who haven't actually worked on open source, some tips for getting started. I'd start with a piece of software you use. That's what I did. I didn't really intend to get involved. I just was like, hey, I use this IM gateway. I should hang out in their channel and see what they talk about and see what features are coming in. But then something came up, and I said, oh, I can help with that. If you don't want to wait around in their channel waiting for work to come to you, a lot of websites now for open source projects have like a get involved link or some other way for people to learn how to get started. Those are improving. A lot of projects have understood that they actually need to do much better at creating these entry portals for new developers and new contributors. And then things you want to maybe sign up for the mailing list, join their chat channel, hop on their support forums or something, whatever is best for you. I hate web forums, but I usually will sign up for a mailing list or join an IRC channel or something. Or you can just skip all that, figure out how you're supposed to submit a patch to the project and submit a patch. There's plenty of drive-by contributors who never look at the mailing list, never join the IRC channel, but they found a problem and they fixed it, so they submit a patch and then they're gone. And that's great. Like, that's a perfectly fine way to contribute. Some tips. So first, be respectful of the people you're working with. This seems obvious, but people can be really mean on the internet, you know? Don't be mean. Also, we get these people who join mailing lists sometimes, and like they mean well, and they say like, I found this piece of the software that's totally horrible and disgusting. I'm gonna fix it. Don't do that, because someone actually wrote that, and they're probably on the mailing list with you, and they're like, you just called my work horrible and disgusting. I don't want to be your friend. I mean, they may have a good sense of humor about it, because it really is horrible. But in general, I wouldn't say, like, I'm going to replace this icon set because the old one sucks. Oh, someone made that. Like, just keep that in mind when you're trying to contribute. You don't want to be like that guy who joined the project insulting everyone on his way in. I say follow procedures in place for contributions. This means if there is a procedure to submit a patch, say you're supposed to submit a patch, you're supposed to attach it to a bug report. If that is the preferred method for submitting a patch, don't send the patch to the mailing list. Like, in some projects, this is okay because they're thankful for any patches. But some projects and some people really don't like it when you don't follow the rules. Like, they have a patch system in place for a reason. So people don't throw random patches at them. It messes up their workflow. It slows everyone down when people don't follow the proper procedures for submitting. And don't be scared off by this, because if you go into the chat channel or ask on the mailing list, you can just ask what the proper procedure is. Like, if you didn't find it obviously on the website, you can just ask someone and they'll help you out. And that's going to be much faster than doing it the wrong way and either annoying people or having your patch or whatever contribution that you worked on completely ignored. Also say, follow through with commitments. This may seem obvious, but it turns out a lot of people who are doing volunteer work in open source think that since it's volunteer work, that it doesn't matter and you can just wander off and not do it. That's not appreciated. Like, I'm much happier to have someone come to me and say, like, I decided to walk my dog to get today and I really don't feel like doing this, so I'm not gonna do it. Like, I am perfectly happy with someone telling me that. If they just disappear with their dog and don't tell me that they've gone for 3 weeks, like, that's kind of annoying, because I'm sort of depending on their work to move forward with my work. Other people are depending on it, and I can't give that work to someone else because it's been assigned to you. So if you can't follow through with commitments, let us know. Like, let someone in the project know that you can't do it. Unassign yourself and leave, because if you unassign yourself and tell us, then I will want to work with you again. If you disappear randomly, I'm not really going to want to work with you anymore because you're not dependable. Or I'm going to put a star next to your name and make sure that I have a backup person for when you disappear. And that's not good. Also, when you're getting into discussions, especially on mailing lists and IRC channels, try to be constructive with your comments. Open source sort of has this famous history of having flame wars on mailing lists and people arguing about silly things. Sometimes important things, but they're arguing about them in silly ways. So I tell people, like, if you find yourself getting into a fight and you're really stressed out and you're at your computer for 4 hours, like typing messages and getting mad at people, like just take a break, take your dog out for a walk, and just like maybe draft your message and then come back to it later before hitting send. Because these flame war things don't help. You really want to be constructive and clear, and you can't do that when you're really mad and hyped up on caffeine. Also, I say collaborate instead of forking. There's something that a lot of new contributors want to do is they find out about this open source thing, right? They're like, I can take this project and fork it and put my name on it, and then it'll be like Liz Linux, and it'll be the best thing ever. Don't do that, because it's really hard to maintain a Linux operating system, or most pieces of software. That's why there's a project and lots of people working on it. So first of all, you forking it and putting your name on it, it means that you all of a sudden have this unmaintainable monstrosity that has your name on it. And then you're not, even when you do make improvements and things, that's not going back to the core project. So yours is pretty much doomed to failure because you can't do it all by yourself. And then the original one isn't getting the benefit of your work. There are exceptions to this. There are times when you want to fork. If a project's completely dead and you have a new team, or there really is some sort of argument within the project where things have to split off, or a company gets involved that people don't like. There are reasons to fork, but in general, like, you really want to focus on collaborating so everyone can benefit from everyone's skills there. And then what we're all here for. So everything I talked about is super important if you want to eventually get a job and build up your career in open source. I'd say a career in open source oftentimes starts with volunteer work. You're in school and you're doing a few projects on the side to maybe build up your resume before you get out into the job market. But understanding how open source projects work, being involved with one, maybe doing a few patches and other things, it's all sort of going into building up a body of work that you can be proud of for your life. So there are a few companies to target and different ways to target companies if you're looking for a specifically open source job. There are companies that only do open source software. So you can look at a company like Red Hat, Linux distribution. They pretty much only do open source software. They do have paid services, so enterprise have to pay a licensing fee if they want to use like the Red Hat name and use the Red Hat updater software. And they do other services and support and things. So you could go work for Red Hat. Red Hat has a couple thousand employees, and they're always hiring good kernel hackers and other people. And there's other open source companies out there. The company that's behind Ubuntu, they do a lot of open source work. Of course, they build Ubuntu along with all the community developers. And then they also have some internal projects, but a lot of what they do is open source. You could work for a company using open source and somehow make your boss let you contribute to open source. So that's what I did at my first job. I was a sysadmin, I mentioned, and I was contributing to Debian. And that wasn't hard. My boss loves Debian, so he was like, yes, we should contribute back. We should go to conferences and do Debian stuff. But even in a company where your boss isn't like that, there's a lot of cases that can be made for contributing back. There's a lot of times when you patch a piece of software internally, it's much easier to send that patch upstream than keep repatching it every time a new version of the software comes out. So there can be ways to convince an employer to contribute back if they're already using open source software. And then you could work for like a larger company or nonprofit that's not in the business of open source software, but they're using it and they're contributing to it, which is pretty much what I did. Like, I work for HP, and obviously HP is not an open source company. They do a lot of awesome things for open source, like donating engineers like me to OpenStack, but it's not strictly doing that. So I found a job at a bigger company that had an open source division, and was able to specifically go for that job. So when I was hired, the job description was like, you'll be working directly on open source. And open source is really sort of the key word you want to look for if you're looking for this kind of job. And then you also want to be someone like people want to work with. A huge part of having a career in open source is making connections and getting to know people. So if you are someone who is a very good collaborator and you work openly, this is a very good indicator that you're going to be someone who's easy to work with. One of the things that both OpenStack and Ubuntu do at the beginning of their release cycle, they put together a series of blueprints, which is pretty much a plan for the cycle. So it says, like, in the next 6 months, we're going to do this, this, and this, and then they assign it to different people. And that's a very open and public plan that people can use to figure out what's going on with the project and what features to anticipate and what the work items are. So if you collaborate on projects like that and make sure you're doing your way openly, being able to collaborate with people, you'll be able to do very well. Yeah.
What type of collaboration are you referring to?
What type of collaboration? So say you're building a new feature in the piece of software, maybe different people putting in patches and collaboratively developing that, or documentation or something. If people are all proofreading the documentation, submitting bugs, and putting patches against the documentation. So just that sort of collaboration where we're all working on different things.
Single leadership roles, or is there?
Oh, it's all single leadership roles, or sort of it's all over the place. So some teams are headed by a leader who has a lot of control. Other teams don't even have a leader, and people sort of just do their own thing, and people get access rights by sort of group vote. So like in OpenStack, you have there's a project leader who's elected every time, but their job is pretty much just to make sure the project's running smoothly. And then you've got core developers who actually have they have approval rights. No one has actual direct commit access, but if you get 2 people approving it, then it gets committed. So there's core contributors who can approve things, and they're just voted by consensus. Like someone sends a mail to the mailing list, be like, hey, she's been doing a great job, we should add her as core, and then everyone says +1, +1, +1, and then they're added to core. So in that case, they're sort of, your peers are electing you into places where you have some sort of power in the project. And that's pretty common in open source. Like you see someone doing a good job, you give them access to the code repository or whatever. And it varies. Like there's some projects have very strict rules about this, some of them are less so.
So I guess I'm curious, like let's say you wanted to apply for a job at some big name company, how could you use your open source, I guess, community as like a credible reference? Like how do you gain credibility in the open source world if it is open to just anyone?
Right, so how do you gain credibility when you're applying for a job if you're working on open source? So oftentimes, if you're going for an open source-ish position, a lot of companies hiring for those kinds of positions are familiar with the kinds of projects that are out there. So if you can say, like, I have been a contributor to Firefox for this many years, and this is my list of patches, and these are the bug reports I worked on. Since Firefox is a pretty big name, then they will see that you did work and that your code has been merged. And even though it's open source and anyone can work on it, there's still, obviously, like, not anyone can actually get code in. You have to be good enough, and you have to do well. So especially on the bigger projects. Like, I was doing a lot of work with Ubuntu, and the people I work with now at HP, they're very familiar with Ubuntu. A lot of them use it on their systems. So like, oh, we know your work. You've done great, and so.
If your company says, oh, well, can you verify that you've done this? Like I guess I'm asking, how can you use other people in your community to verify what you've done and if that's necessary, I guess?
All right, so how you can use other people in the community to verify your work. So since you're contributing in open source, like your name will be on a change. So oftentimes you don't necessarily need someone else to vouch for you because like the change went in and it's got your name on it and you can tell your employer like, look, I did this. But also like I've used open source people as references for jobs before, like big time. And they know my work in open source and they can speak to how I collaborate and how I work with people. And that's perfectly valid. Like I've never had a problem with that. Even applying to HP, some of my references were directly from open source, and it hasn't been a problem. Yeah. Right. I say, of course, participate in mailing lists. And the last one here is mentoring other project members. I didn't really realize how important this was. I sort of do it naturally. Like my friend Paul here, like he's awesome at like helping newcomers. Like I think it's something we just enjoy doing, so we just do it. But it turns out when you help people, especially newcomers to the project, and they go off and do awesome things, like they remember you. So when you're looking for a job, you all of a sudden have all this huge pool of like people you used to mentor, but all of a sudden have this job at IBM and like can now hook you up. So mentoring people actually has turned out really awesome for me because now there's people doing amazing things, and you know they end up being part of my professional network as well. And it doesn't really take a lot of time to mentor people. You think it may be this like big professional thing, like you know, awesome, complicated thing, mentoring. But really, it's just being available if someone wants to send you an email now and then and say, hey, I got stuck on this thing, help me out. Just a few minutes a week, really, like helping someone out can be huge for them, and it can be a huge benefit to you. So definitely taking time to help out new people and get them started. I will say most people just disappear, but it's totally worth it for the people who stick around and go on to do awesome things. And then all this stuff has been pretty big for me, is being visible in the community. I'm very shy. I don't like talking to people. I'm scared. I work from home. But I found at a certain point that if you're going to quietly be hacking away at things, you can easily be ignored sometimes, just because fast pace of open source software, and there is time when quiet people do get recognized. But it helps a lot if you're sort of out there and vocal about the work that you're doing. If you're the type who writes, I suggest having a blog. A lot of technical people don't like writing, but it's been super helpful to me. And I will mention that there's a GNOME outreach program for women that does an internship for women in open source projects. And one of the things a lot of the interns for OpenStack were doing is they were writing like super basic, like this is how you submit a patch. Like they were writing it in their blog based on their experience, not like the super technical wiki page that we have. And they were, you know, sharing gotchas and little things. And so this is super beginner stuff, but they ended up getting so much traffic for these posts because that was something that was missing in the community. So even though they were writing about beginner stuff, they became very well known in the community for being able to explain things. And I think like half of them ended up getting jobs right after the internship. One of them is actually working with me at HP now. So having a blog, like she had a great blog, she still does, where you write about open source work. It's great, even if you're writing about simple things. Even if you're writing about silly things, like sometimes I'll write a blog post about like this configuration option that I couldn't find because it's not documented, and when I found it, it like changed my life. So blogging about silly things like that you find, like you'll find that like those are the most trafficked thing on your website because other people are looking for the same answer. I say go to events and conferences. Good job. Even if you're shy, I hate these things. I'm so shy. I don't talk to people, but I know some people here that helps. But I say even if you're shy, like just getting out there and having people see you at conferences. Like I never met my boss at HP, even though we'd gone to tons of the same conferences, and he's like, I know your work, and I'm like, oh, cool. But just because I was there and I was present and I was active in the conferences and summits and other things. Also speaking at events, especially if you're shy, because I found that I'm shy like talking to people, like going up to people, but if you speak at a conference, it turns out they'll come up to you afterwards and they'll have a reason to talk to you. So you don't need to be good at talking to people because they'll talk to you. It's awesome. So speaking at events is very good for, obviously, visibility. And then always say yes to interviews and speaking opportunities. Some people love this because like they're asked to be interviewed and they're like, oh yes, that's because I'm awesome. But for me, I was like, don't interview me. That's scary. You don't want it. I don't know what I'm talking about. But it turns out, usually when people are asking you to speak, they actually do want to hear what you have to say, and they're asking for a reason. And I also found out early on that as a woman in open source, I need to be more visible because there aren't a lot of us, and we need more of us. And having people, women who are visible is super important to that. So that sort of got me started doing all this kind of stuff, even though it's not my favorite thing. And I don't like talking about myself. And then also things like engaging other users of the software. One of the really cool things that the OpenStack project does is they hold their developer summit and their user conference at the same time, at the same place. So there ends up being some overlap in tracks, and then the developers can really get to talk to some of the biggest users in the industry right there at the same spot. And they can invite them into design summit sessions, like say like, oh, you have this problem, we're having a session about it later, can you come and tell us as a user like what you're doing? So engaging with users of the software, whether it be at a summit or like on a forum or a mailing list or something, just sort of getting the pulse of the community and getting to know some of the key users can also help lead getting you to a job. There are oftentimes I get into a conversation with someone at a company using the software. At the end of the conversation, they'll be like, "So are you looking for a job?" That's an awesome place to be in. So engaging with users is definitely a good way to find jobs. I love software and I love technology. This was at a developer summit for Ubuntu, and we were in this was in Brussels, and he's actually a Fedora guy. Fedora people, yuck. No, just kidding. But I told him to come to the summit because I thought it would be fun. So we did. It was fun. We had a great time. And that's pretty much all I had. Questions? Yeah.
Is that your email address at the bottom of the screen?
It is. lyz@princesslea.com.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about the different development culture? So an HP person works on an open source software development project, and that same HP person might work on an in-house HP software development process. So what's the same, what's different between the two?
So the question is about development cultures, maybe someone who's working inside a company and outside a company, proprietary versus open source. That's an interesting question. So there are some people who really want to just work on open source. There are a certain type of people, I work with a lot of them, but then there are people who work both open source and internally, and they tend to be people who are, oftentimes they've worked internally for most of their career. So it's sort of been an adjustment to work in open source. And it's been tough. Some of the internal groups I've worked with at HP, like they're really used to sitting in a conference room and planning out their software and then just landing this massive patch. And I tell them you can't really do that in open source. Like you have to break up your patches, you have to do iterative changes, and you have to do things slowly so people can review them, you have to do them public, and that's horrifying to them. It takes a lot to move your workflow from sort of an internal proprietary model where you're not working with lots of other people. You only have the company's interests in mind and your customers. Whereas switching to a more open one where you have to do small commits, have very open plans with everyone that meets the needs of everyone, and then perhaps you're just working on the part that's important to your company. But it's definitely a different culture, and it's a switch for a lot of people. And some people do it beautifully, and some people just go back to proprietary software in their own company because it's actually hard to make that switch. I mean, I think I'd have a hard time going the opposite way, like going into proprietary software where like we're writing these massive things and not working with everyone in the world. If that answers. Yeah.
So, working for a commercial company and being a contributor to open source project, do you run into issues where like the interests of the company versus the interests of the community? I mean, you're still doing open source, but like there might be some design decision which might be better for your company versus like the future of the project and those sorts of things.
Yeah, so it's sort of conflict of interests between the company and the community when you're working on open source. It certainly does come up. We've been pretty lucky in OpenStack that a lot of the companies sort of have the same goals and very similar things. Also with open source, if a company really wants a feature like enabled, they just throw more engineers at it. Like HP will hire a few more people to work on that one feature in OpenStack and it'll get in. Because it's sort of consensus based and things will go where the engineers are. I mean, if one company just piled on tons of engineers, they could take control of a lot of the OpenStack project in theory. I mean, it hasn't happened. I mean, there's a lot of developers from a lot of different companies, but no one's really taken a huge leap of like piling tons of engineers to make things go their way. It could happen, but that's the way it would happen. Like you wouldn't just stop contributing to open source. So one of the things HP did is initially when they wanted to use OpenStack and they launched HP Cloud, they took a version of it and they pulled it in-house and they did a bunch of things to it. They patched it and they did all kinds of things. And it sort of turned into this monster because that's what happens. When you do open source and you don't contribute your patches upstream, you end up with a fork that's like you can't upgrade it to the next version. So HP figured this out, and a couple of years ago they started hiring a lot of people to actually work in the open source project, which is where I ended up. So now, with the new version of HP Cloud that's coming out, it's actually synced back up with what's in the open source version. So they had engineers like applying all the things that we did in-house to like the open source project. So while there can be conflicts, usually just by working harder in the project and adding more engineers and more manpower to the problem, it gets solved. But honestly, it doesn't happen all that much. The companies sort of understand this now, that if they're collaborating on a project, that means they're not spending billions of dollars developing the whole thing themselves. They're spending millions on a few engineers. Like, they're not. It means they don't have full control, but it means they get something that's very usable for a lot cheaper.
Do you ever run into issues working with companies like this where they're concerned about the flow of information, for example, proprietary information into an open source project?
Yeah, so the question is whether companies are worried about proprietary information leaking out into the community. There's definitely concern about that. We do have to be careful. There's one project I'm working on where we're sharing this HP internal doc that has company names on it, and we've shared it with a couple project members who work at HP. And there's like big red letters at the top being like, "This is not to be shared." like this has customer information. Like, we don't want this out. Like, we're sharing this with you because you need to implement the test or whatever. But like, this is not for public consumption. Don't share this with the whole world. And so companies sort of are worried about that, but I think they largely trust their engineers, and there's clear rules about what you can share and what is public and what is not. Like, when we get memos and emails, like the first thing, like on HP emails, will be like, this is confidential or not. And then we just have to be conscious of that. Also, when we're having discussions, we sort of in our minds just have to be like, okay, we want this feature implemented, but we're not going to tell you it's because it's this company or whatever, So we do have to censor ourselves a bit, but it hasn't really been a big problem in practice. I don't think companies are hugely worried about it because they trust their engineers. Right. So right. It's like I guess a piece of software that was developed in-house and was proprietary, and you are creating an open source version, or someone is?
Working on an open source version, and HP just kind of wants to add a few features or something like that.
Right. Yeah. So if you're building upon like a piece so that, I mean, I'm sure there's places in HP where we're like competing against each other unintentionally, but it's never really been like an issue. And also, the license of OpenStack means that you can they use the Apache license, which is not. It's more of a permissive license, so you can build pieces of your own on top of it without contributing those back. And a lot of companies do. Like, that's a huge part of OpenStack. So like, HP doesn't use the dashboard that's shipped with OpenStack. We wrote our own interface for customers to log in and stuff because the dashboard that ships even today isn't really mature enough for a big company to use. And we have different authentication systems and different backends for customers and all kinds of things. So you can do that in OpenStack. So we do build pieces on top of it, and it's also very pluggable. So if you're using a different virtualization backend, for instance, you can change that out. And some people do use proprietary backends, and that's okay. So, I haven't seen any major like conflicts though. So.
Just to follow on to that, so OpenStack is Apache, he said, and then I'm guessing with Ubuntu there's GPL type related things. Do you see a difference between working in a community that's like GPL versus something like BSD or Apache?
Yeah, there is a bit of a difference. So I'm not actually allowed to work on AGPL projects working with it at HP. So there are things I can't work on now because of my employment. And that happens a lot with GPL. Like, some companies won't allow their employees to contribute to it. So those are like copyleft licenses, right? And then you've got more permissive licenses, and I can pretty much contribute all I want to all of those. It's just like legal sort of worries about some of the things. So if you end up working for a big company, you do have to be careful of like whether you're allowed to contribute and what sorts of projects you're allowed to contribute to. Like GPL v2 is fine for me, but the lawyers get a little grumpy about v3, so I have to be careful. Like, I can contribute to them, but it's not like something we want to really bring into the core of OpenStack or something. So there's also things like copyright assignment and contributor license agreements. Those can be very limiting for a project. One of the things Canonical did, the company that funds Ubuntu, they have a pretty strong contributor agreement that assigns a lot of the rights to Canonical, and people are very uncomfortable with that. So a lot of people can't contribute to Ubuntu anymore because there is this contributor agreement that is somewhat unfavorable, they believe. So yeah, licenses are a huge deal in open source, and it's something to pay attention to. Maybe not initially, but especially if you start working for a company, you do have to be careful and check with your boss and check with whoever to make sure it's okay to contribute. But definitely the ones with permissive licenses, like Apache and MIT, those licenses they get more contributors because more people can commit to them. Yeah.
Care about what projects you contribute to in your free time, especially with like licensing restrictions?
Yeah, so projects I contribute to in my free time. So there's a process at HP to give them a list of projects that you work on and then get approval. For me, that's not a problem because I was hired to work on open source and it's important that I continue that work. But for other people in the company, there may be greater oversight. But yeah, there is a formal process in HP, and a lot of the bigger tech companies do. None of my colleagues have had a problem with it. So. Cool. Thanks, everybody.